welcome to my sewing room. My name is Christine and this is my channel, Christine Sews a Lot, where I talk about all things sewing. Today I am dressed very comfortably in my Yanta overalls by Helen's Closet and a Union Street tee by Hey June Handmade. And I'm dressed comfortably because I have a big day of sewing planned. I am participating in the hashtag Project Dress a Girl that is running the month of September by Marty of Marty Sews. Now with all things, I'm going to link them in the description box below. So if you want to learn more about the hashtag Project Dress a Girl or the organization Dress a Girl around the world, there'll be a lot of information below if you decide that you would like to participate, and I hope you do. For my project, I have pledged to sew 12 dresses. I chose the number 12 because I thought that is the number of dresses that I could put out in a big sewing jag. I'm going to take you along with me as I sew these dresses, and I'm going to give some tips and tricks on how to get a very neat finish on this beginner-friendly dress pattern. It is the A-line Jumper by Martha Pullen, and it is from an older book. It's from a 1991 book that Martha Pullen put out. Applique is the title of the book. It's still available on eBay, but I think that these techniques could be used on many dresses, and the technique for the nice clean finish on the inside, I use it on many of my children's patterns. Meet me at the cutting table. I'm going to sew 12 A-line jumpers for Dress a Girl around the world, which provides dresses for impoverished girls. Normally, my least favorite part of sewing is cutting out the pattern, and followed by cutting out my fabric. For this pattern, it is so easy because there are only two pieces. You have a front piece and a back piece. You can always tell the front piece because the tabs at the shoulder are shorter than the back piece. This has a very simple construction, and I have a method for making this go quick and easy. The first step in the sewing process after you have it cut out is to sew your front and back together of your main fabric and your front and back of your lining. I'm choosing this cute giraffe print to be my main, to be my outward facing. So to make this easy for me to remember when I'm doing batch sewing in particular is I always put them together in the same order. I'm going to sew along the right side seam, and for the main fabric, I am always going to put my front piece on top of my back piece, line it up, and this is where if you're super careful cutting out your pattern, it makes the rest of the sewing process go quickly. Did you see how quickly, no tricks of the camera, I was able to line up this piece here? I lined it up from here to here and sew along the seams. Then on your lining piece, you do the opposite. And this is how I remember it. I've got my lining back is going to be on top of the front, and then it's going to be pinned along the side seam. And that is because after we sew these seams together, we're going to match them right sides together. And we're going to want the lining front to match up with the lining main fabric. I'm going to show you what that looks like. Okay, I have my lining pinned to the main fabric, right sides together, and I'm going to pin all the way around the top, and I'm going to pin the bottom. I'm going to leave the two sides open right now. I'm just pinning the top, which includes the armholes, and the bottom. And the tip that I learned was to trim away a little bit of your lining so that your lining doesn't end up hanging out of the edge because it's a little shorter than the main fabric. It'll pull it taut and you won't have a drooping lining. So then I just go to the bottom, even though it's a little shorter, and I am on my B team for my pins here, and just pin the lining down. And then I'm going to go to the, when I have that done, I'm going to go to the machine and I am going to sew along the bottom and sew all around the curves. And I will show you what that looks like. I thought I would show you how cutting the lining a little shorter will pull the main fabric over. So this lining is not going to end up hanging down with the finished dress. So that was why we cut that lining a little bit shorter around the bottom. I'm not sure how well this is going to pick up and show because I am rubbish at sewing with the tripod between my knees. I have lined up the edge of my fabric with the edge of this presser foot because I know on this machine with this particular foot that is pretty darn close to 1/4 inch seam allowance. Something that I've found in going around curves that I'm better off doing it as a continuous motion than start, stop, start, stop, start, stop like I did in the beginning. So I'm going to reduce the speed on my sewing machine and show you how I do it. Okay, as I'm coming around, I'm really not applying a lot of pressure. I stop before I get to each pin. I never, or at least never intentionally sew over a pin. And I'm just gently guiding the fabric around the curves. My needle does stop in the down position, and I'm just going around the curve. If ever I did see that I was going wrong, the other thing I do is I try not to let my fabric drag down off the table because then that might pull me off. I have the needle down. I'm going to lift up the presser foot and give it a little turn. And just make my way around the corner. Pull out that pin. And keep sewing along. Like I said, my hand is not really pushing it. It might look like I'm pushing it, but I'm just guiding it. It speeds a little too slow for me. Sometimes I feel like if I'm sewing at a super slow speed, it's the same as with the super fast speed, I tend to make more mistakes. Now I know on my foot about where, when the fabric comes to the end of this foot, is going to be 1/4 inch. So I leave the needle down, I turn it, pull up my pin, and away I go. If you do a nice job on your curves, that makes all the difference. And it's worth unpicking if you go over a little too far or you feel like the seam is not as smooth. It's worth unpicking. I have sewn the dress together, 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, and I think this pattern is a great pattern to practice going around curves. As you see, there are several curves that I had to go around. And with practice, you can do this very neatly. I've sewn all along the top and the bottom. The next step is you're going to clip the curves. Now, I like to use pinking shears to do this. And I want to show you a little tip on using the pinking shears. Now, I want to clip. I do not want to clip the thread. This is mainly just allowing this to turn neatly. And I find it's best to clip or to cut, since I'm right-handed, with what I'm cutting away on the right side of my scissors and what I want to save and not clip into on the left, because I can see it better because the scissors in my hand and arm aren't getting in my way. So I'll just start clipping around. I don't really need to. I could just use regular scissors to trim on the straight, but since I'm using these, I'll just go ahead and use them. And I'm just being careful. I'm also keeping in mind that this dress is going to be getting a lot of wear. It is probably going to be the only dress the girl has. And so I don't want to take chances on clipping super close on the corners, and I'm not going to be as aggressive at poking out my points, because I don't want there to be any extra space to where there could be some fraying. So I'm just going to be careful with that. As I'm going around, I find it's really easy to see what I'm doing because of the red thread. It's easy to see from this side, but I get to here, and that's kind of an awkward angle for me to cut. So I just flip the dress over, and even though I have white thread in my bobbin, I can still see my stitching lines close enough to go around. And I'll just continue to clip around. This is what the dress looks like after you have clipped all the way around. I clipped the bottom with my pinking shears, and I've gone all the way around the top. You can tell that I press as I go. So I started out, before I cut out, I ironed my fabric well, and I press as I sew. That makes for a neater finish, and also I think it saves me time in the long run. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to pull my dress right side out, and I'm going to poke out my shoulders, and I will use a chopstick or some type tool to poke them out nicely. You can poke them all out. In addition, I'm going to roll my seams. And what that means is I just take my fingers and I make sure I have a nice seam. And because I used the pinking shears, that is not difficult to get the seams to lie flat. So this can take a little more poking. What I'm going to do is I'm going to poke out the corners. I'm going to take it to the ironing board. And this is a critical step here, because this is your opportunity to get this tab to look really nice. Before you sew up the side seams, you want to get this really nice. Let me show you what that looks like. I am auditioning this Bluebird fabric by Cotton and Steel as a new ironing board cover after seeing how dirty my ironing cover looked. I really do need a new one. So I'm going to show you my ironing technique. Ironing is such an important step in sewing, And oftentimes beginners in particular will skip this step or maybe not iron as often. And maybe you can see, I'm not sure how it's picking up, I've got these little wrinkles, it looks, along the curve. I think I can iron those out and steam them out. I have turned my dress right side out, and now I've poked out my tabs. I'm giving it a nice iron so that I don't have any of these little imperfections when I sew up the side seam. Lots of steam. Now already my garment has wanted to lie nice. See how nice those curves look? And that's because I did take the time to use my pinking shears and clip all around. So there's not a lot of work to be done on this. I will spend more time on areas like over in this direction where I had some puckering and see if I can straighten it out. And I also pay attention to the side seam. It's so easy for this to get pressed in on itself. Sorry about that. So I'm giving it a nice press. Don't be alarmed when you're sewing with red fabric in particular. When you stick that hot iron on it and you get a little darker shade or you get the imprint of the iron. Now I wouldn't be plopping this iron down and leaving it for a long space of time, but that color will revert back to the regular color. It's just kind of a temporary transfer color. It's predominantly in reds. I don't know the science behind it. I just know it to be true. So I'm just going to look and double check that I have a nice iron, nice press, that I don't have wrinkles. Pull out any of those wrinkles around the curve. I don't have too many on this particular dress, which is good. And I'm going to do the same at the bottom. One of the things I like about this particular pattern is the design of the armhole. This is a very modest design. A little girl can wear this without a shirt underneath and be perfectly modest. Or she can add a shirt underneath and it'll still fit nicely, and that will let her wear it longer when the temperature starts getting cooler. This is a dress that I have turned. This is the next step. I turned it right side out. I poked out my corners. These I did not poke out as aggressively as I might have if I were making it for one of my nieces, but sometimes you can get a little fraying if you poke too close. So I do what I think is a really nice poke out, and then I iron it really well. You can see the dress is starting to come together. Now on this particular dress, I used the pocket pattern that was included and put a little pocket up here in the center of the dress. On the other dresses, I chose to design my own pocket, and I'm going to show you later how I did that. But can you see how that's coming together? When it's actually sewn up, the back is where the button's going to be attached, and your buttonhole will be on the front. And you can already see what the dress is going to look like when it is finished. The next step is you are going to turn it inside out again. Now I know we just spent all that time ironing it and getting it to look lovely, but I'm not going to be turning the shoulders inside out. I'm just going to bring them inside the dress. like so and turn it inside out. And this is how we're going to get that really nice, clean finish. All right, so this is the bottom of my dress. Here's the top of my dress. And I am going to reach through the side seam. It doesn't matter which side seam. I reach my arm through, and I'm going to grab, so I've got the lining running across my arm here. I'm going to grab this other side and bring it to where my arm entered the dress. And then I'm going to match my dress, lining to lining and main fabric to main fabric at the side seam with right sides together. And I'm going to pin all the way along. I'm going to leave an opening in the lining side. And let me show you how I mark my opening so that I remember to leave the opening. So this pink is the lining of my fabric. And I want to leave, this is a larger dress, so I want to leave an opening about yay big. And I'm going to pop 2 pins on either side. That'll remind me where I want to start and stop so that I leave the opening so I can turn the dress through this opening. That opening you can close up later. You could use a slip stitch or ladder stitch, however you know the name. Or you can do like me and you can just sew it up by machine because it's on the inside of the dress. If I were making this dress reversible, I would use the slip stitch so that the stitches would be hidden. And this pattern can be made reversible, but I am choosing, since I have that really cute fabric and I can't imagine not wanting that to be the fabric that shows, and plus that's the one I've put the pocket on, that will be the fabric that shows I'm not going to make this reversible. Here's a dress where I've pinned all the way around. This is my outer fabric. I don't know if you can, it's coming up on the camera, the flowers. And the chevron print is the lining. And you see I've got it marked with the double needles or the double pins. This is where I'm going to leave my opening, and I'm going to turn the dress through that opening. Okay, here is a dress where I have left the opening. So let's turn it out and see what it looks like. This is more of that fox Robin Hood looking fabric. I think it's a Riley Blake fabric. I doubt it's still available. Something I got at off the clearance table a few years ago. I'm gently pulling it through. This dress is a size 1. I was trying to use up my fabric responsibly, so I chose pattern sizes to make according to the amount of fabric I had so that I wouldn't waste it. This comes out nice and quick, and there we go. I have turned it out. You see, this is the opening that I'll be coming back and closing along the side. Let's turn it right side out so you can see what it's going to look like. And because we took the time to pull these corners out and press them, we've got a nice looking dress. Now I'm going to go to the ironing board and I'm going to give this another quick press, and the next step will be to sew close the opening. From there, all that's left to do is to choose the buttons that I want to use, to add my buttonholes and sew on my buttons, and I will have a dress. Okay, it's time to close up the hole in the lining. I have given it a press, and since you can see through this fabric very well, I have turned under the opening a little bit so that it would match up with where I have sewn that seam. And I've made sure that I'm only sewing the lining. You can see that the main fabric is pushed out of the way. And I'm going to take some pins. I'm just going to pop a couple of pins in this to close it up. And to be honest, most of the time I don't use a pin, but I definitely did in the beginning. And this lining has a little bit of weight to it, so it wants to behave very well. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start sewing here, which is a little bit before the opening. And I'm just going to sew this down to a little bit past where it is opening at maybe 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and secure this well. I've already changed my thread over to pink so that it would match and be hidden. Again, oops, sorry about that. I've already changed my thread over to pink so that the stitches will not be as obvious. There's no reason not to make this pretty. I want this to be very secure and sturdy. I want it to hold up well. I'm going to line that up. I'm going to sew. You probably can't see, but I have a little notch on my presser foot that I'm going to use as my guide. Off. Let me reverse. Lock in that stitch. I knew that I wanted a patch pocket for the front of the dress. So I made a mark on the pattern of where I wanted to place the pocket. And I drew a rectangle, the approximate size that I wanted to have the pocket. I took this rectangle and I matched it up along the side of the pattern, and then I drew a curve and cut the pocket to the size. It's not a very scientific way of doing this. I'm not a pattern drafter. I just needed something that would work well for the girls, and I think it turned out kind of cute. I took this pattern piece and I drew a line at 1 inch. So when I cut out a pocket piece out of the main fabric, I folded out this line and I cut out the pattern piece. Then for the lining, because I did line these pockets, I unfolded it and I cut out a piece of the lining. Then when I sewed the pockets together, I would sew them along the lining and the main fabric along the top. Then I'd fold it right sides together and stitch around the outer edge. Turn it right side out. This edge was unfinished, and that gave me a little accent detail along the top of the pocket And then I just place the pocket on the dress and sewed it on the front of the dress before I constructed the dress. Time for buttonhole placement. I like to place the button 3/8 of an inch away from the seam line on center. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to mark it with my friction pen. I've made these dresses so many times. I do a little of this by eyeball. The pattern instructions don't actually tell you what distance to place the buttons. They just tell you to add the buttons. And that is what I have found that I like. And the hot iron will take away these marks. So now let's go and install the buttonholes. Before sewing your buttonhole on your actual garment, you're going to want to run a test one. So I'm going to do this just the same as I would do on my garment, with the same fabric I would be using and a little scrap of paper that goes underneath. This really helps with the finish of your buttonhole. I have a buttonhole foot, which makes this such an easy project. I go to my machine and I'm going to tell them I want to do a buttonhole. I'm going to select the type of buttonhole I want and the length. This is a 20mm button. Occasionally I find I have to go a little larger, but let's just try it at 20 and see how it works. This also gives me the opportunity to test the fit of the buttonhole to the button. First buttonhole worked out fine. So I'm ready to do the buttonhole on my garment. And my little piece of paper, stick that underneath the presser foot. And I'm going to just take a moment to line up the buttonhole where I want it. That looks good. I'm going to take the speed down a little bit more. And off we go. There we go. I'm going to put fray check on this, trim the loose threads. I'm going to knock out all the white buttonholes that I plan on putting in. And then I'm come back and show you how to easily sew these buttons on using your sewing machine. And you don't need a fancy sewing machine to do that. If your sewing machine can do a zigzag, you can attach these buttons. All right, I'm coming in close so you can see what I'm doing. I have marked where I want to place my button with the friction pen. I'm just going to take my button and put it right over that dot. I'm doing this one-handed, so forgive me for the shaking. And this is a little tip that I learned, was that sometimes if you just drop your presser foot down, the button will slide and shift because it's not perfectly flat. So if I lower the needle into the buttonhole and then put the presser foot down, it's nice and secure. Now I have a button stitch for attaching buttons, and right now my setting is on 4mm. Before I had this machine, I did the buttons the same way. It's just a simple zigzag stitch, and you drop your feed dogs. If you don't drop your feed dogs, you're going to have a mess because the feed dogs are going to want to push your work through instead of staying in place doing that zigzag. So I've got my button secured in place, and now I'm just going to start my stitch. As you see, it's a simple zigzag. I'm going to run it twice so that I have a super secure button that will hold up to many wears. Future Christine here. I did have to take a little break because Hurricane Ida was bearing down on us. We were fortunate and only had tropical winds. My heart goes out to all of those impacted by the storm. I have 12 dresses here, and I tried to make the most of my fabric. And if I could squeeze a baby dress out of the fabric, I did. So I got some extra bonus dresses. I wanted to show you the detail on the pocket by cutting the pocket lining a little taller than the main pocket. It adds this nice detail, this trim at the top. So these are my 12 dresses for #Project Dress a Girl. And I'm very thankful to Marty of Marty Sews for hosting this. I think this is a wonderful charity, sewing dresses for impoverished girls around the world. Do follow the other sewists who are participating. Look for the #Project Dress a Girl. I am going to link to a video on the end card. I hope you have a joyful week and find the good in all things, especially sewing.